So here we go. So I want to welcome everybody to our May edition of the Africa Political, the APCG online colloquium. We are very happy today to have Jori share her work with us, and special thanks to Peter and Susanna for serving as discussants for today. So, as usual, those who have joined us before, we usually don't, do any presentations. Of course, Jori would have about 5 minutes to tell us a little bit about the project. In this case, the project that she's going to embark on, the kinds of feedback that she's looking for, particularly the difficult areas that she might want us to focus on during the discussion. We would then give Peter and Susanna about 15 minutes each to provide their prepared feedback for Jori, and then the floor will then be open for the rest of us to join in the discussion. So that's how today is gonna go. So Jori, if you don't mind, if you can give us a, up to 5 minutes or something brief about your project, and then we will take it from there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, George, and thank you all for joining and engaging with my work, especially at this early stage. So to provide some background on the project, this actually started as a project about what characteristics of armed groups make it more or less difficult to deliver aid in areas under their influence. And so I was interviewing humanitarian practitioners about this question and was just struck by how many of them brought up this phenomenon of beneficiaries being so central to this process of negotiation. And some of them brought up in particular how there was this mismatch between what beneficiaries wanted and the aid that they were receiving, and how this influenced their willingness to put themselves in danger by negotiating with armed groups over humanitarian access. And so I became really interested in this question and was thinking about how this idea could be tested. And so as the conjoint experiment stands right now, these are the attributes that I have perceived as being important from my interviews with humanitarian practitioners and also reading secondary resources. The goal before I conduct the survey is to work with RISD, who will do the survey, to conduct focus groups with beneficiaries in South Kivu to hear from them what attributes they perceive as influential in their perceptions of aid workers. And so the goal is to modify the conjoint experiment to reflect what is said in those conversations. But I would be really curious to hear what people think about the attributes that I've focused on so far, if there's things that you perceive as being missing or irrelevant, perhaps, of the ones that I have brought up. I'll flag a few things that would be particularly helpful to hear feedback on. The first one is how you would all think through the ethical challenges that come with doing a survey in a context like this. In particular, for people that are familiar with Eastern DRC, how much of a risk do you think there is that enumerators will be threatened to give up data, or how much of a likelihood there is that respondents will be threatened based on their participation in such a survey? And if these things are a risk, how would you go about thinking through and addressing those ethical challenges? The second 2 points have to do more with the experiment itself. I received a comment a couple months ago that I've still been grappling with, that in this part of the survey and the part of the experiment that identifies the type of aid project, right now is very general: food, cash, water, sanitation. And I got this comment that this is too abstract and that people aren't really going to have an idea of what this aid project would be. My concern with bringing up more specific aid projects is that there would be an aid project included that just doesn't make any sense for that village disadvantage, that perhaps they already have access to clean water and they are presented with this aid project that there would be a well, and they're just like, why am I even being asked this question? So that's my concern. So if anyone has thoughts on how abstract or specific this project attribute should be, I would be really eager to hear about that. The second experimental component that I'm struggling with is, I guess the causal mechanism right now is supposed to be that when a project is more accepted by the community, then the chief would be more likely to be willing to negotiate with the armed group. There's a chance that the chief is, instead of making that consideration, considering how willing an armed group would be to accept that project, how easy it would be to negotiate with the armed group, based on what the project is. So let's say armed groups are more likely to accept health projects than cash ones. And so a chief sees, oh, well, this is a health project, so it's going to be easier to negotiate, so I'm going to be more likely to negotiate it. So someone mentioned to me, and I would have to do a lot more reading first, but the idea of conducting a mediation analysis where before the chief would make the choice, yes or no, I would advocate for this project, you would ask them a couple more questions to try to get at the mechanism. So in the case of the mechanism that I'm proposing, how popular do you think this project would be with your community? And in the case of this alternative mechanism, how easy do you think this would be to negotiate with an armed group? The hesitation there is that a crucial assumption of using this method is that it can't have an independent influence on their response. So like if they weren't already thinking of this stuff and it then influences them to think about it, it messes up the experiment. So if there's any thoughts on that, I would also be grateful for those. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Peter and Susanna, and thank you so much in advance for your comments.
Great. Do any of you have a preference who goes first, or fine? Okay. So
I have no preference.
Okay. So we start with Peter then, please.
Thanks a lot. So Jori, fantastic. As you know, right, we already talked about this. It's interesting, very important. What I like as well is that, you know, this is not a finalized paper or a paper that's close to being finalized. It's a research design before you go into the field. So I often think this is the best moment to kind of get comments on this. So I've got a whole pile of comments. And George, I've got 2.5 hours, right, to give comments?
We are all ears.
So I just sent around an email with my comments written up. So I'll just mention a few of them here and then see how much more time there's later on. But and kind of the comments have the following structure. I'm first going to kind of say some of my worries, and then for each of those points, I'm hopefully providing some suggestions of kind of how to overcome it. So starting off, so the very first thing, it's kind of almost taking a step back and kind of looking at kind of the connection between your research question and the empirical strategy. So the argument that you're making is NGOs need to have community acceptance because that will lead to a humanitarian access, right? Because then the community will kind of act on behalf of the NGO when necessary. Now, interestingly, this study uses a conjoint. And what a conjoint does, of course, it's really well suited to learn about the importance of different characteristics or the interaction of different characteristics on something. And then particularly in this case, we're looking at a conjoint that explores different NGO characteristics and then whether or how that has an impact on whether a local leader is willing to kind of actively engage with an armed group. But that's different than the argument. So kind of the argument kind of states that you will have, you know, the variation that you're interested in, independent variable that you're interested in, is community acceptance, right? And at the moment, the conjoint doesn't really get at that. The conjoint looks at 4 different types of project characteristics and their interaction and whatnot, but not so much community acceptance. There seems to be somewhere in the background this idea that, I don't know, if you change one of these characteristics or something, it will lead to more community acceptance or something like that, but it's not nailed down. It's not explicitly made. So kind of starting off with that, then now coming to slightly more constructive. So one thing that you can do is kind of try to explore this empirically, see if indeed manipulating those bits of characteristic leads to changes in community acceptance. And one way how you can do that is, and this is quite common in conjoint experiments, is to have a set of follow-up questions to try to better understand what's happening in these different type of profiles that you present to a leader. So one very obvious follow-up question is, okay, so given this profile, do you think that your community is very strongly in favor of this project or something like that? Mm-hmm. So that's the first one. It's kind of within your current framework. Then the second suggestion is kind of stepping kind of a little bit out of your framework, but still using this idea of a conjoint experiment. Well, your actual variation that you're interested in, it seems, from your argument, is community acceptance. Well, can you make that a characteristic in your conjoint experiment? To really test it directly, empirically, is that particular characteristic important for the chief becoming active? Now, of course, that you probably then also have to change other characteristics in the conjoint and all that, and you still have this horse race then between the community acceptance versus other types of factors, which you might not want to have, but at least it brings the direct variation of community acceptance. Okay, and then the third idea, and that's really kind of stepping away from the conjoint stuff, is, well, if you're really interested in kind of this variation of humanitarian the community acceptance, why not just ask? So I don't know, ask the leader, if you have an NGO project that is really liked a lot by the community, would you then blah, blah, blah. And I know, we've got problem of cheap talk and whatnot, still very informative, I think, and particularly if you ask it as an open question. Now, of course, the other thing being a kind of a fieldy type of person, I immediately thought like, okay, how realistic can we make this? Can we actually kind of pretend to be humanitarians that are kidnapped and then see, what? And of course, the answer to that is, please don't do that. But I think one thing that is possible would be the following. So there have been a large number of randomized control trials in this region. I've undertook a few of them. And funnily enough, at least I know for a few of these projects that we undertook, is they were really, really loved by the community. So we actually know like 95% of the people kind of really loved it. So kind of community acceptance really high. Well, there you've got your variation. You've got a whole set of communities where you have an NGO or at least a project that have high community acceptance, and you have them communities where, well, the NGO wasn't there. So I expect the NGO to have very little community acceptance over there. Mm-hmm. So, maybe compare those with each other. Just ask the chief at the end, if that particular NGO, I don't know, somebody gets kidnapped or something, would you go and undertake activities too? So you kind of build up on already existing work. Like we probably would have to think about IAB approvals and all that before we can give you the location of the control and treatment groups and whatnot. But it seems to kind of stepping out of the conjoint thinking, this is one way to really get your independent variable and get variation of it. One of the other things that could be interesting as well is not only ask about the particular NGO who did the project, but also asked about another NGO and kind of learn about, might there be spillovers? If people are very excited about one NGO, might they also be excited about other NGOs? So the second one, so I've got kind of say 3 big things. No, actually I've got about 7, but I'll go over 3. So the second one relates to Congo and the Congo context. So as you know, I've been working there for about 13 years, still have the feeling that I absolutely do not understand what's happening over there. But kind of 2 things worried me kind of when reading this. It seems that this project and the argument really really works for a very specific type of armed group, right? So the idea here is that, well, kind of civilian acceptance, community acceptance is really important because then civilians can go and make demands and interact with armed groups. And armed groups are willing to do that because they kind of depend and need the community. So this idea that these are armed groups that kind of want to govern, or maybe I think nicely use the words kind of outgovern the state. And then my question is, well, in the Congo, really many of these groups, maybe even most, are actually really predatory. So they don't really depend upon these communities. So then, of course, the big question is, how does the theory apply here? Mm-hmm. And then the second thing I wanted to raise, particularly related to the Congo context, is that, so the idea here is that the survey will focus on the village chiefs, because they are the primary actors involved in negotiating humanitarian access. And my question is, really? So probably, if I would have to put money on it, yeah, they probably will be really important. But I expect another actor to be also extremely important, and these would be, for example, religious leaders. So when there's fighting taking place, different rebel groups against each other, or even kind of problems with the government and whatnot, it's often the Catholic Church that gets involved. They're often being seen as kind of this independent actor and whatnot. So kind of given this as worries, then kind of maybe moving to the suggestions, 3 of them. So one of them is, I would maybe first, and I was already really happy to hear that you were thinking about doing focus groups and all the other things. Kind of within this document, I would say write a really careful overview of the Congo. Like how does this work in the Congo? And then you can incorporate work by Raul Sanchez de la Sierra and Soren Hen, and there's a whole set of other actors that have done phenomenal work, thinking through work on governance by armed groups in the Congo. The other thing, and I'm happy to hear that I think you're going to do that, is before, of course, undertaking something as big and massive as this, 750 villages. Before you start doing that, I really indeed would do some qualitative work. So talk with a bunch of village chiefs. Would they ever negotiate with an armed group? With which type of armed groups would they do it? Why not? But also talk with NGOs. So particularly the bigger NGOs have these security officers. Kind of how do they interact with armed groups? So really just kind of sitting down at the outset and then kind of, building this Congo context up a little bit more. And then the third one is kind of the suggestion is that it really felt that the current document really seems to be looking at one side of the coin. And what I mean with that is that, so humanitarian access is currently very much like, okay, if the NGO is liked by the community, then the community, might be willing to negotiate. But of course, the armed group has to be willing to negotiate, right? In order to negotiate 2 sides of a coin, and you need to have both of those partners, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to negotiate. So, wouldn't it also be very important and interesting to understand both? So if you're going to undertake this such a large endeavor of collecting all this data, wouldn't it be really interesting and maybe even important to maybe then do a second coin join experiment or another type of strategy to also learn about the characteristics of these armed groups? So to really understand, both sides of the coin.
Survey members of armed groups.
Sorry?
You mean to survey members of armed groups?
No, not necessarily. So you can ask the same village chiefs, do a coin joint, and have different characteristics of armed groups. Are they close by, type of ethnicity, how violent are they, do you have family in there, I don't know, whatever, those kind of things. And the third kind of umbrella topic that I wanted to raise is specifically on the coin join experiment. And I'll raise 3 points. I've got many points there, but I'll just raise 3 of them, and then maybe later on I can bring up a few more if need be. So on the coin join experiment, what I liked a lot about it is that it's not one of those forced choice conjoint experiments, right? Because generally, I think when people think about conjoints, you give people you give a village chief, for example, 2 different types of profiles, and you say, okay, which one do you prefer? So that's not the case here. You've got 6 different profiles that are being presented, so 6 different types of NGO projects, which has issues in and of its own, which I also kind of wrote down and sent to you. But then for each of those profile, you will ask the village chief, so kind of given this NGO project with the following characteristics, are you willing to undertake action? Now, my big worry is the following. My feeling is the village chief is going to say either yes to all of them, or is going to say no to all of them. Mm-hmm. Because they either love that there's an NGO project in the village, just kind of on the outset, and will say yes to everything. Or if he already thinks that, oh my God, there's this armed group, they're really violent and whatnot, there's no way in hell that I'm going to interact with them. So it doesn't matter what the kind of how the project looks. So really kind of, I'm really nervous about variation in your dependent variable, because kind of the nice thing of this setup is that you hope to get variation within the village chief, because that gives you a lot of statistical power, but I don't think that you will get it. Just because of the fact that these small project characteristic changes. So I don't know, is there a complaint box in the village or not? That's not going to change whether village chief is going to negotiate with an armed group or not, I think. And I think related to this is that the example that you gave, I think, was quite illustrative. You gave the example of Ebola in Congo, that they had this Ebola treatment center, and then people were kind of chased out of that Ebola center. Well, the reason why they were chased out of that Ebola center was not because they had a complaint box or not, but they were chased out because there was something really big going on. People were just kind of, it was seen as a direct threat to the community, like a really big deal. And that's why people really got involved. The second thing that I wanted to raise related to the CoinJoin experiment is the worry of cheap talk. And what I mean with that is the following. So the enumerators, even if they are Congolese, they are external from the village, right? Same with RESD enumerators, they're absolutely fantastic, but they're generally from the big city. They're really well educated compared to the villagers, also to the village chief and all that. So they're really very much outsiders. And very likely by the village chief, they will be seen as maybe part of an NGO or part of the development community, right? And as a result, the chief might think the following, and the chiefs, and I know many of them in that region, they're smart, they're extremely strategic, they're smart, they know how the game is being played. They really might see this as like a very first step, a very first exploratory step of maybe an NGO, where an NGO kind of tries to test the waters a little bit, like, okay, if my guys get kidnapped, will the village chief actually help getting my guys out from the armed groups? So then the village chief, if he thinks that, will definitely say, yes, of course, I'm going to get them out, just to make sure that the NGO project actually shows up. Okay, so there's this good bit of strategic thing going on, and I'm really quite worried about that. And then the third thing, and what I said, I forgot a whole set of them, but I'll stick to this one, and then I'll stop. So at the moment, there are 4 different characteristics of interest. And it's this idea that these 4 characteristics are really important to get community acceptance, which is kind of community preferences. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Is it actually a project that is useful for the village or people actually want? Do the aid workers provide the communities with relevant information, the origin of the project staff, and the presence of a feedback mechanism? So is there a complaint box in the village and whatnot? Those are very subtle mechanisms, right? Complaint box or not, is that really going to change community acceptance or not? Maybe, but Congo is one of those places where you don't want to be too subtle with your treatments, because there's a lot of noise happening. So aren't there other characteristics that might be maybe more powerful? So instead of, or maybe in addition to, is there a feedback mechanism or not? Well, I was thinking, well, what's the biggest thing if you want to get community acceptance? The size of the grant, right? For $10, the chief is probably not going to do anything about your project, and community couldn't care less about it, particularly if you have village meetings and whatnot. You're just going to piss people off. But if it's a project of $200,000 or $20 million in the village, which of course never going to happen, that's serious money, and you probably get community acceptance for that. So kind of, I think there are a few other characteristics out there that are really big, really important, and maybe more or maybe stronger than the ones that you're currently looking at. Let me leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you, Susanna.
Yeah, great comments, Peter. So I'm going to try to build on them and also point out a few additional things so as not to be too repetitive. Yeah, I think the mechanism is one of the big issues here. And so, I mean, essentially the relationship that you're looking at is you're assuming, aid actor via programming communicates with community, leads to community acceptance or not, right? Leads to the willingness of the community to facilitate access for the aid actor or not, right? And so there's a big, as Peter rightly pointed out, there's a kind of really important box that you need to unpack there, which is thinking about, what is the relationship between some type of community acceptance, however measured, and the willingness of the community to facilitate some kind of relationship with the armed group. And that depends both on the characteristics of the armed group, right? Which is why kind of getting something about that and kind of how risky that negotiation is. It also depends on the kind of broader benefit, the kind of added value of the project to that community. And so like these two things are very much likely to affect the chiefs or any other community members or religious actors' willingness to negotiate. And so thinking about how you incorporate those and thinking about, you know, and kind of Peter's suggestions to redesign the conjoint, whether or not you can actually design the conjoint to get at in some clear way these things, right? So one, you can take kind of get some data on the broader opinion, perception of the armed group and how risky that armed group is for the community, but also how valuable the aid is for that community.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really important. So that's going to be relative to other aid. That's going to have something to do with like duration and scope, other options. So really kind of thinking about how to unpack that. But the other thing that I was really kind of struggling with is that, you know, what is the particular and unique role played by communities that is not influenced by the aid actors' relationship with the armed group? And so this really, I think, relates to how a basic assumption and how you're thinking about aid programming, that, you know, all of these things, which for me in your conjoint, right, like there's one choice and everybody's going to choose it. Cash, yes, information, a worker origin is a tricky one, and I think you're not actually fully capturing the variation that matters, and community choice, right? But if the NGO is actually implementing that ideal type, then it's likely that the NGO already has relationships with the armed group and the community. Because in order to maintain any kind of in an area where there is significant armed group presence, then any aid actor that's actually been there over time, developed these relationships, provides information, listens to the community, listens to feedback, has really well-informed, you know, people working for the aid organization, is going to have strong relationships in one way or another, or at least some type of negotiation with an armed group. And so that means that you don't have this kind of independent effect of aid on community. The aid is actually affecting both community acceptance and armed group acceptance at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I'm really kind of, and I think Peter may have done a better job at giving you solutions than I will, because I'm still struggling kind of to think about how you deal with this. But I think you need to unpack your mechanism a little bit more there and think about what's the real variation that you want to capture in terms of aid actor behavior, right, on the one hand, and then community behavior on the other hand, even if we can hold armed group behavior constant. And you may be able to do that. And also thinking about that actually relates a little bit to your ethical challenges, that if you can think about maybe not going to the most difficult locations where there is a particularly difficult or predatory relationship, maybe going to those places where there's a better relationship, then you might be able to get at kind of you might be able to hold the armed group's behavior a little bit more constant and get at some more nuances between the aid actor and the community relationship. And I think certainly Peter would be better positioned to tell you about that in Eastern Congo. I've done research there, but not at that degree. And it's really about understanding what variation there really is. Another point that I have is kind of, you know, first I have questions, which I won't go into too much, about whether the chief is the right person, right? So they're huge. You say, you know, you assume really that the community is a unitary actor that is represented by the chief, and that's a problem, right? Because that's not true. And so thinking about, by talking to the chiefs, whose preferences are you actually getting? that relates to a third point, which is, what are the other ways that communities benefit from aid? It's certainly not just about service provision, right? It's about power. It's about kickbacks. It's about who's employed in the community, which is what explains a lot of the variation also in perceptions about aid. So it's almost like, what's fascinating in kind of reading this from the perspective of some of the aid literature that you begin to draw on, is that kind of shows how narrow and flawed that literature is, and that it assumes that, oh, if you have feedback, everything's fine. If you listen, everything's fine. No, it's like, aid is money, right? This is about power and resources going into a politicized environment with scarce resources. And so I feel like, those things that are going to lead the community to actually, take the risk, controlling for degree of risk if you can, right? Take the risk of facilitating access with an armed group, are going to be related to individual benefits as well as collective benefits. And that will certainly come up in depending on how good your focus groups are or how good your qualitative work is, that certainly would come up. But I don't know exactly what to do with that at this point, because you're not going to be able to design a conjoint around that, as far as I can see, unless you kind of focus on some list experiment prior to it. So you can think about doing that. But I think that as I said, I feel like your hypotheses are a straw man, because there's one obvious choice, and you could say, well, that's great, right? Then it's a strong treatment. I would expect this, but I'm not even sure, as Peter said, that this, cash program where there is information, where even you have some, you could say, mixed national, international with community choice. I'm not even sure that that's enough to lead to risk taking. So it's really that kind of empirical question about what leads to risk taking for negotiation. For me, the biggest thing about the design is actually kind of social desirability bias, and whether they've experienced a scenario or not. That you're kind of, you're designing this in a bit of a vacuum about what exists in terms of NGO behavior on the ground and what exists in terms of negotiation. And it really matters whether this is something that's regular, right? Or whether it's a kind of rare event, for whether or not people are willing to take the risk to do it. So I think, any chief worth, mostly his worth, is going to say, yeah, I want this project, because there's no risk for this person saying no. And you have no check as to whether, one, they've ever experienced a project like this before, or whether they have actually taken action to resist it before. So in this, Jori, we've talked about this, but in this piece that I have that just came out in JOP, which is about aid actor behavior, of course, one of the most important things about our scenarios was those who had actually experienced this conflict scenario, and those who had experienced changes in aid allocation behavior. So we could show that they'd experienced both of these things before, and therefore that gave some value to their kind of sense of what they would do. But in the absence of some real kind of manipulation check for them, this could just be people saying what they think you want to hear.
Right.
I think my final point, and I'm sure we'll get into more in discussion, I think my final point is really kind of related to the ethical challenges. And honestly, so the way that I think about ethics is not just in terms of doing harm, but in terms of doing good, right? So the third ethical principle of justice is about the equal benefits or the equal distribution of harms and benefits, right? So do no harm, right? But also think about what is the value added. And I think for me, that's the real question. Like, this is a lot of money and a lot of people's time. And so is there a way of thinking about this where you can say, I'm going to learn such something that's not just interesting for the kind of scholarly literature, but I'm going to learn something that actually is going to be interesting for, you know, community leaders and for aid workers operating in spaces like this. And what is that going to be? And I'm going to actually do the work to find a way of distributing and disseminating that information more broadly. That actually changes your ethical calculation, because you can deal with the potential risk to enumerators, to participants, right, by choosing, you know, places that are where they're less predatory armed groups, which is fine. And you can say, look, I'm not dealing with that population. I'm you know, accepting a certain degree of cooperation. And within that certain degree of cooperation with armed groups, I'm trying to look at how the aid actors' behavior influences the community's behavior. That's fine, assuming that you have enough variation within Eastern DRC to be able to do that. But the broader question really is, okay, given that, what are the questions that I need to ask so that I am taking full advantage of this money, of the work that everybody's doing, so that we can maybe add a little bit more nuance to both these discussions about, you know, what is a good project and what projects are actually doing, and to these discussions about armed group community behavior, right? And their interaction with aid actors. So I know this is a tall order, and I know that you'll have to narrow all this down, but I would really think about your ethical considerations in that broader sense, and then that does change the calculus. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. These are great comments. So should I respond, or should we collect other comments and then respond?
Yeah, so well, we have about 20 minutes remaining. So if you want to respond to any of this or add some follow-up to Peter and Susanna, you can do that. Otherwise, you can also just ask, we can also open up to others to add more to your list of comments.
Okay. Maybe we'll open it up just so I can make sure to collect as much as possible and then respond if I have time.
But if, yeah, of course, if you want to respond to anything now and ask for follow-up, you can also do that.
Okay.
So my sense is that you would want to open it up to other people as well at the moment.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do that.
All right. So, well, if you have some comments for Jori, you can say it now, type it. You can, raise up your hand and I'll give you a call. Rob, and I'll start collecting hands. So Rob.
I have a few comments. First of all, on a positive note, as you get mired in the details of the methodology, I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that this is an incredibly valuable project, and this will be an insanely valuable contribution to research on acceptance and research on humanitarian negotiation. And you are absolutely right that the role of the community and community leadership deserves more attention and has gotten lost, and you are filling an extremely important gap. And I can't wait until it's published. It's going to be great. Okay, so here are my sort of more constructive feedback comments. One is, when you are conceptualizing an acceptance strategy and the four things that you identify, from my perspective, you're not hitting on the main thing that is what people talk about when they're talking about an acceptance strategy, which is effectiveness of programming, like building trust with community, and principled humanitarian action. I don't know if there's a way to build that in, or if it makes sense to build that in, but with something like that missing, people who know about acceptance, I think, will probably be like, why isn't something about that there? I don't know if there's some way you can build in like effectiveness, which is sort of different than like type of programming, whether it's food, health, cash is like Are the people who need it most actually the ones getting the food?
Right.
Is the food actually like what people want to eat and need to eat? Stuff like that. And like, like corruption, I don't know, like reputation, corruption of the aid organization. Something like that I felt like wasn't captured. I think the second big thing that I just wanted to flag is the issue of what you're measuring and not measuring has come up in the discussion about community acceptance, and that you're not measuring community acceptance directly. You're measuring an acceptance strategy directly, but you're not measuring community acceptance strategy. I just wanted to flag that the other thing that you're not measuring is the impact of community leader advocacy on humanitarian access. Your dependent variable, I think, is whether community leaders will advocate or not. Your dependent variable is not humanitarian access or not. You're leaving that outside the box. Maybe you can somehow build that in, but at least the way it is now, it's not in there.
Yeah.
So just wanted to sort of flag that as something that is a thing. I guess those are the two big things. I have other thoughts. Maybe I'll just say a small thing is just the word beneficiary. There's a backlash against the word beneficiary. You might not want to use. Yeah, you might not want to use the beneficiary, the word beneficiary. But I'll leave it there for now. I have some other comments, but I'll let someone else talk.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
All right. So I had some two finger on Rob's point. I think you cited obviously you're aware of the whether there's a connection between what chiefs accept and whether there are people interests are aligned with that. And I wondered whether you were aware of, or Peter and others are aware of any project that look at that connection about representation of chiefs within Congo. Are they really spokespeople, representative of their people or not? And that might help, I guess, address that concern, if there is anything like that. That's what came to my mind when I was thinking about that question. Anyway, Meg, I hope that's the name.
Yeah, no, Meg is fine.
Okay. I learned that from Rob, so if I got that wrong.
Meg is perfectly fine by me.
Meg,
Thanks. So thanks for this project. I had I think a lot of similar comments that I think were so wonderfully articulated by Susanna and Peter and Rob. So I'm going to try to maybe build on those. But for what it's worth, as I was reading through this, I found myself asking a lot of questions that I think will help you flesh out the scope conditions and like what needs to be in place for your argument to work. And I'll email you this, but I think in like a future version of this paper, I would like a lot more description of this particular context. So what do these armed groups look like? How much variation is there in terms of their relationships with local communities? Also building on George's comments, I had a question about what kind of ties that chiefs have with local communities and how much this varies as well. So I can think of other contexts where chiefs don't have that much of a good relationship with local communities, or there's leadership disputes. And that also plays into different aspects of an ongoing conflict too. So I think if you could answer those, like I would have a better understanding of like what needs to be in place for this argument to work and how much community acceptance really matters. One other thing, when you're going through this assumption that, chiefs, reflect important like community interests, like, do you really need that? I think, building off of Susanna's comments about this being, a story about power and money and like local politics, like maybe you don't need so much the chiefs or other actors to really be representative of community interests for aid actors to get access. But if they're gatekeepers with local political influence, like that's enough, right? So, I mean, I think it'll take you in a different direction because you have this focus on community acceptance, but if you're really interested in access for aid workers, then I think maybe stepping back from that and thinking about the influence of whether it's chiefs or the Catholic Church or like other actors is going to be important. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'll email you my comments. Yeah, thanks.
Susanna, please. Oh, okay.
Sorry, David, I can go after you.
Yeah, David.
Hi, Jori. Thanks so much for this. I'm an international lawyer. I'm not a social scientist, but I work on issues of humanitarian access at the University of Cambridge. I'm a PhD student. So a lot of this is really outside my wheelhouse, but I did have a few observations just based on past work as a humanitarian in West Africa. And a lot of them kind of overlap with things that other individuals have said. And I think one of the big things is that the research design seems to be concentrated on will local leaders advocate and what will make them advocate. And I'm curious about the front end. So do local leaders represent communities, as well as the back end, does advocacy lead to access? And so I think they're kind of different sets of questions that maybe are leading to different types of responses. And I think what Megan just said is really important about if it is a question of local leaders and their capacity to affect access. I think that's a super interesting question and a really important one, but it is different than one about community acceptance. So if it is the former, then as Peter said, talking about chiefs, talking about other types of leaders like religious leaders, that's a really, you could expand the group beyond that 750. But if you are interested in community acceptance, then I feel like the types of people you might talk to are different, and it might be a whole lot more focus group discussions with those types of individuals who are part of the community, but who often get marginalized by community leaders. Community leaders tend, at least in my experience, tend to speak to and for particular parts of the community rather than the community as a whole. And so those leaders, they're blind spots. And then I guess related to, I think Rob talked about humanitarian effectiveness. And yeah, I mean, I think touching on that literature could be really interesting, like the literature on humanitarian effectiveness. And I'm thinking of the echo chamber project that Giuliano Fiore at Save the Children UK did a while back, because I think that project tried to, in some ways, unsettle the type of characteristics that you present. Like, are those 4 types of characteristics, which often get talked about when we talk about aid effectiveness, are those really the characteristics that align with an effective program, or are there different characteristics?
Right.
I think that's it for me. I hope that was helpful from someone who's in many ways an outsider. But this is a super interesting project, and like Rob, I'm very excited to read the paper because it looks interesting and important, and it'll make a great contribution.
Thanks, David.
Susanna,
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I mean, all excellent comments. I think that, Jori, so as I was reading through, you're very light on the aid literature in general and on the programming literature. And so, and in many ways, it's because the literature that you're coming from, which is really the literature that talks about non-state armed group behaviors or rebel governance, doesn't actually effectively deal with how international aid actors behave. And so I think part of this is about looking at aid effectiveness, but as this echo chamber project finds, I'm not really sure that the literature is going to help you that much there. But I think actually even more so, you should read through evaluations and critiques of aid in Congo. And this is not Severine stuff, right? This is much more kind of work that's more impact evaluation or different kinds of evaluations to get both the language that aid actors are using, how they're thinking about it, and to think about to think about also what kind of work is really being done in Eastern DRC. And so this community we have represented on the call maybe represents more of the kind of humanitarian community, but the peace building and development communities are also quite strong in Congo, although the development community tends to be centered in Kinshasa. And so, but thinking about, as you're looking at your kind of scope, it's not just about scoping out, the questions that Megan put forward, about what do these armed groups look like, what kind of ties do chiefs have with local communities. On that side, it's also really about scoping in and scoping out who are the international aid actors that you're talking about. Is this kind of purely the ICRCs and the MSFs, right? Or is it SAVE? Is it CARE? Right? Is it the kind of a bunch of development contractors who are working for the US government? Because once you go into that different space, they have different practices. They're doing different kinds of work. They're going to be involved over different periods of time. So there's like a whole set of variation in the behavior of aid actors that's likely to influence that. And this variation is partly captured by your treatment, but certainly not completely. And that's not to say let's completely throw your treatment up in the air, right? Because you have something there, but I think it's about, is there a way to write a treatment that begins to capture the kind of quality of behavior of the aid actor that you want to get at? Right, much more so than what you're doing. So you can think about is there a way of kind of collapsing some of these characteristics? Like, okay, because these all in many ways relate to kind of a learning organization, right? So what would be one way of representing that in terms of how the aid actor engages with the community? And then maybe is there something else where you can represent effectiveness? So I won't go on too much more about this because we're short on time, but there's a whole literature out there that you at least need to figure out how you're dealing with. And I think reading the aid documents and evaluations, or at least the NGO documents and evaluations, would help you, like figure out people don't talk about beneficiary, right? So CARE talks about neighbors, different actors talk about this, or partners. So different language is used by different organizations, but really thinking about that side, I think will help you to scope in.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I know we're really short on time, so I just wanted to pick up on two threads that were brought up.
Jori, Peter also had a comment.
Oh, okay. I'll
Peter, yeah.
Cheers. I'll keep it very brief. So this wasn't yet in my the comments that I sent you. So that's I'll briefly mention it here because it builds up on what some of the people raised here, kind of a two-finger. And this really relates to this idea that people, it seems from the discussion that people would like to see a little bit more the unpacking of the chief. What do they do? Kind of how much are they involved in all these different things and all that? Do they have gatekeeping powers or not, and all that? So just for your information, in 2010, we did a large survey in Eastern Congo, about 900 villages or something, that explicitly had a survey for the village chief. So we've got like so much information on the chief. And then we did a similar survey in 2015 again, with again about 800 villages. And I expect about 200-300 of them to be in South Kivu. The representative sample, only the Fizi territoire is not in there. The rest, it captures all the groups, the territoires that you're interested in. And the data is publicly available. So I'm very happy to kind of guide you through it.
Okay, excellent.
So it could be very useful. And the second thing, and I just kind of wanted to highlight it, I really like Susanna's point when it comes to kind of the ethics part. Don't only think about kind of the costs of it. Because kind of, I'm really not worried about, I've done so many surveys over there now, like there are easy ways to kind of, go to these places and interview people, and that's all fine. But also think about the potential benefit. And I really like that because particularly this topic, it's so beneficial for NGOs. And we often write in our grant proposals like, oh yeah, and I'm going to present and I'm going to give my information to the NGOs because, donors love to hear it. How often do we actually do that? We should. And particularly this project, I think, is useful for that. So kind of also thinking to on the benefit side instead of only at the cost side.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. So we're out of time. This is so much to unpack, and I really deeply appreciate all these comments, especially at this stage. It's just invaluable. So I really appreciate your time and engaging with my work.
Great project, Jori. Thank you.
Susanna.
Yeah, well, thank you guys very much. And thanks, Jori, for sharing your work. I think it was very exciting to listen to the feedback. And I hope it was helpful as you have expressed. And thanks to Peter and Susanna very much for preparing some comments for Jori. So join us again in the audience and participants who joined Jori to give her some good feedback. We hope you join us again in our next colloquium next month. So look out in the spaces for our invitation, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks so much, George. Thanks for doing this.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah,
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Great work, Jori.
Thanks. Bye.
See you later.
Hey, Rob, I need to reach out to you about another project. So I'll send
Really?
you a message.
Okay, that's intriguing.
Great. Excellent.
I'll look for your message.
Sounds
Okay.
great. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.